You are standing at the bottom of a wall that should not exist. Not because it is old, the world is full of old walls, old temples, old stones stacked by hands that have been dust for 2,000 years. It should not exist because of what it is made of. 3 blocks of limestone, set side by side, forming a single course partway up the western foundation of a temple in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. Each one is roughly 19 meters long. Each one is about 4 meters high, 3.5 meters thick. Each one weighs somewhere around 800 tons, more than 2 fully loaded Boeing 747s, more than the steel hull of a small warship, cut from solid rock and somehow, at some point, in some manner nobody has ever fully explained, lifted, moved, and set into place with a precision that still makes engineers stop and look twice. They are called the Trilithon. 3 stones. And there is a 4th one still lying half a kilometer away in the quarry where it was cut, because whoever was building this wall of impossible stones apparently looked at it and decided it wasn't good enough to use. Let that sit with you for a moment. Somewhere, at some point in antiquity, someone had the tools, the manpower, and the sheer audacity to quarry an 800-ton block of stone, and then reject a slightly bigger one as not worth the trouble. Tonight we're going to walk through Baalbek, a place whose name most people outside Lebanon have never heard, and whose engineering nobody has ever satisfyingly explained. Get comfortable. This is a slow one, and it doesn't end with an answer. It ends with you looking up at 6 columns against the sky and understanding, a little better, how much of the ancient world we're still just guessing about. Baalbek sits in the Bekaa Valley, a long fertile strip of land between 2 mountain ranges in what is now eastern Lebanon, close to the Syrian border. If you flew over it today you'd see terraced farmland, the sprawl of a modern town, and then, rising out of the middle of it, entirely out of scale with everything around it, a platform of stone the size of several football fields, topped by 6 freestanding columns almost 20 meters tall. They're visible from kilometers away. They were built to be visible from kilometers away. Whoever finished this wanted it to dominate the horizon in every direction, and 20 centuries later, it still does. The Trilithon forms part of the base of that platform, the retaining wall beneath the Temple of Jupiter, on the side facing the valley. 9 similarly enormous blocks, each in the 30 to 60 ton range, run beneath the Trilithon and above it, forming a foundation course that already would have been remarkable on its own anywhere else in the ancient world. The Romans built things at scale everywhere in their empire, the aqueducts, the colosseums, the roads that still exist under modern highways. But nowhere else on earth, in any Roman structure, in any structure period, do you find blocks like this. Nowhere else in the ancient world, actually, nothing from Egypt, nothing from Mesopotamia, nothing from the Andes, comes close to the raw mass of the Baalbek stones once they're in position and finished. Try to hold the comparison in your head for a second, because numbers this large stop meaning anything if you don't anchor them to something familiar. The largest stones used at Stonehenge weigh around 25 tons. The largest blocks in the Great Pyramid of Giza, the ones people spend entire documentaries marveling over, top out somewhere around 80 tons for the granite relieving chambers, with most of the pyramid built from blocks in the 2.5 ton range. An 800-ton Trilithon block is, by weight, roughly the equivalent of 10 of those Great Pyramid granite giants fused into a single continuous piece of stone, quarried whole, never assembled from smaller pieces, never mortared together, one uninterrupted slab that someone cut free from a hillside and then decided to move. Now walk with me 800 meters up the gentle slope behind the temple platform, to the quarry where these stones were cut. This is where it gets stranger. Still lying in that quarry, never moved, are more blocks even larger than the ones in the wall. One of them has been known for centuries by a name the locals gave it, Hajar al-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman. It is estimated to weigh somewhere close to 1,000 tons, bigger than any of the three that made it into the Trilithon. For most of the 20th century, it was considered the largest cut stone block from antiquity anywhere in the world. Then, in the summer of 2014, a team from the German Archaeological Institute was excavating around the stone of the pregnant woman, mapping the quarry more carefully than anyone ever had, when they found something even bigger buried directly beneath it. A block 19.5 meters long, 6 meters wide, 5.5 meters thick. By volume, it works out to somewhere around 1,650 tons, heavier than the stone of the pregnant woman, heavier than any single Trilithon block, the largest known cut stone from the ancient world, full stop. Nobody had known it was there. It had simply been left, face down, forgotten under later spoil and centuries of dust, so long that the archaeologists ended up giving it exactly that name, the Forgotten Stone. Picture the moment of finding it, because it's a strange kind of discovery, not a hidden tomb, not a sealed chamber with something glinting inside, just an unusually large, unusually flat rise in the ground that a survey team decided was worth a closer look. Digging around a monument everyone already knew about, expecting more of the same, and then slowly realizing the trench they'd opened kept going, and going, past the point where a normal excavation would have hit the bottom of a stone. The German team spent weeks carefully clearing spoil and later debris away from the edges before they could even get an accurate measurement, cross-checking the dimensions twice because the number that kept coming back, over 1,600 tons, was larger than anything previously documented from the ancient world, and nobody wants to publish a record like that without being sure. When they were sure, it made headlines internationally, one of the very few times in the 21st century that a biggest stone in the ancient world claim held up under real scrutiny instead of collapsing the moment an actual archaeologist looked at it. And the quarry still isn't finished being examined. Ground-penetrating surveys and further excavation seasons since 2014 have continued in the area, and researchers involved with the site have been candid that they don't consider the picture complete, that the quarry could plausibly still be hiding blocks nobody has measured yet, simply because so much of it remains buried under debris that has accumulated for the better part of 2,000 years. It is a genuinely rare thing in archaeology, a field usually associated with painstaking work on tiny fragments of pottery and bone, to be able to say with a straight face that the biggest object of its kind in the ancient world might still be sitting in the ground, unfound, less than a kilometer from a well-documented UNESCO World Heritage Site that tourists have been walking past for over a century. Why leave a stone that size in the ground? The team studied the tool marks and the rock quality at its edges and found a likely answer, and it's a strangely human one, not myth, not magic, just a very expensive judgment call. The stone quality near one edge was compromised, prone to cracking under the stress of being moved. Whoever was overseeing this project, 20 centuries ago, looked at nearly 2,000 tons of finished quarry work and decided the risk of losing it in transit wasn't worth it. They cut their losses. They started a new block instead. And somewhere in that decision is a hint of just how routine this must have been for them. Quarrying stones over 1,000 tons wasn't a once-in-a-civilization miracle, it was Tuesday. It happened often enough that they could afford to walk away from a bad one. So how did they move the ones that did make it into the wall? This is the part people love to argue about online, and the honest answer is that we don't have a single ancient description of the method, no papyrus, no inscription, no engineer's diary saying, and this is how we did it. What we have instead is engineering reconstruction, working backward from the physics. The French engineer and archaeologist Jean-Pierre Adam did one of the most cited calculations, using known ancient technology, timber rollers, sledges, earthen ramps, and capstan winches with teams of oxen or laborers hauling in coordinated pulls. He estimated that moving a single 800-ton block would require somewhere around 40,000 people working in careful unison. 40,000. For one stone. And they would have needed to do this at least 3 times, plus dozens more times for the smaller 30 to 60-ton blocks beneath and above the Trilithon course. One detail works in humanity's favor here, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the kind of thing that makes an impossible problem merely an extraordinarily difficult one. The quarry sits 10 to 15 meters higher than the temple platform, and the entire 800-meter route runs downhill. Gravity was doing some of the work. It doesn't make the achievement any less staggering. Coordinating tens of thousands of people to control the controlled descent of an object that could crush anything in its path if the ropes failed is arguably harder than just dragging something across flat ground, but it does mean the physics stop requiring anything we'd call impossible. Difficult, yes. Unprecedented in scale, yes. But not physically impossible with organized labor, timber, rope, and time. Whether that reconstruction is exactly how it happened, nobody can say for certain. It's the leading explanation, not a confirmed one. It's worth addressing directly, because if you've spent any time online you've probably already run into it. Baalbek is one of the most popular sites in the world for the idea that ordinary human engineering simply couldn't have done this, that the Trilithon must be the work of some lost pre-flood civilization, or a landing platform for something not of this earth, or evidence of ancient technology we've since forgotten. It's an understandable impulse. When something looks this far beyond ordinary human effort, impossible, feels like the honest reaction. But archaeologists who've spent careers on this site point to something the fringe theories tend to skip past. The tool marks in the quarry match known Roman quarrying methods exactly: iron picks and chisels for cutting the outline, wooden wedges driven into the seams and then soaked with water so the swelling would split the stone along a controlled line, the same technique used across the Roman world from Egypt to Britain, just applied here with unmatched ambition. The pottery, coins, and construction sequencing found at the site date the platform and its temples firmly to the Roman and pre-Roman Phoenician periods, with nothing in the archaeological record supporting a civilization older or more advanced than what we already know built here. The genuine mystery was never who, it's how, at this scale, with this little room for error, using tools we can hold in a museum today. That turns out to be a much harder question to dismiss than aliens did it, and a much more interesting one to actually sit with. Before we go further, if this kind of thing, the place's history left half explained, the stones and cities and questions nobody has closed the file on, is the kind of company you like keeping at night, consider subscribing. It costs nothing and it means more of these find their way to you. Now, back to the valley. To understand why anyone was building at this scale here at all, you have to go back further than the Romans, because Baalbek was already old when Rome arrived. The name itself is a fusion, Baal, the storm and fertility god worshipped across the ancient Near East under different local titles, and Bek, likely referring to the Bekaa Valley itself. Long before any Roman columns went up, this was already a site of worship, a place where the Canaanite and Phoenician populations of the region honored a sky and storm deity on a platform that may itself have incorporated even older, pre-Roman megalithic stonework. Some of the massive foundation blocks beneath the Roman-era temples show tooling and placement techniques that some archaeologists argue predate the arrival of Roman engineers entirely, though this remains genuinely debated rather than settled. When Alexander the Great's conquests swept through the Levant in the 4th century BCE, and the region passed into the hands of his Greek successors, the site was renamed Heliopolis, City of the Sun, folding the local Baal cult into the Greek sun god Helios, a common move in an era when conquerors preferred merging local gods with their own rather than erasing them outright. It kept temples running, kept priesthoods employed, kept populations from revolting over religion on top of everything else they'd lost. Then came Rome. When Augustus established a colony here around 15 BCE, Colonia Julia Augusta Felix Heliopolitana, to give it the full mouthful of a name, the site entered its true golden age of construction, though construction undersells what actually happened. This wasn't a project finished under one emperor's reign. It was an undertaking that ran across generations, arguably close to 2 centuries, with successive emperors adding, expanding, and embellishing the sanctuary as a display of imperial wealth and reach. The god worshipped at the center of it all became Jupiter Heliopolitanus, a three-way fusion of the old Phoenician Baal, the Greek solar Helios, and the Roman king of the gods Jupiter, standing in for all of them at once, worshipped by a population that had, by this point, absorbed 3 different empires worth of religious tradition into a single figure carved in stone and gold. The temple built for that fused god was the largest religious structure in the entire Roman world. Not merely large for a provincial sanctuary, larger than any temple in Rome itself. Originally it stood on 54 columns, each roughly 20 meters tall and over 2 meters in diameter, quarried not from the immediate area but from Aswan in Egypt, shipped across the Mediterranean and hauled inland just for the columns alone, an engineering and logistics operation running parallel to whatever was happening with the Trilithon blocks in the local quarry. Today, only 6 of the original 54 are still standing. 6 columns, in a row, 20 meters up, visible for kilometers, and that fragment alone is enough to make Baalbek one of the most photographed ruins in the Middle East. Try to imagine what 54 of them, plus a roof, plus the gilded statue that once stood inside, would have looked like catching the sunset over the Bekaa Valley. Jupiter's temple wasn't alone up there. Beside it, and in far better condition today, stands the Temple of Bacchus, smaller than Jupiter's temple only by comparison, since on its own it's larger than the Parthenon in Athens, and it happens to be the single best preserved Roman temple anywhere on earth. Walk through its doorway today and you're looking at a ceiling, columns, and carved reliefs of grapevines and gods that have survived nearly 2,000 years essentially intact, something almost no other Roman temple can claim. The entrance alone is framed by a lintel block so massive that a keystone near its center has slipped slightly downward over the centuries. Visitors are shown the crack as one of the temple's quiet, ongoing dramas, a fragment of ceiling that has been very slowly failing since sometime in antiquity and simply hasn't finished falling yet. Inside, 42 columns ring the cella, each fluted, each topped with an ornately carved Corinthian capital, and the walls above them are covered in a procession of carved figures, Bacchus himself shown being raised by nymphs, vines and grape clusters twisting through friezes of ritual scenes, faces worn soft by weather but still unmistakably human, still unmistakably watching whoever stands beneath them. A little further along sits the smaller, more delicate circular Temple of Venus, elegant where the other 2 are monumental, and the great court in front of Jupiter's temple, ringed with altars where animal sacrifices were once made in full public view, smoke rising up past those same towering columns. For centuries this was one of the great pilgrimage and oracle sites of the eastern Mediterranean world. People traveled here specifically to consult the god, to watch the ceremonies, to stand in a courtyard built from stones too large to properly comprehend and feel, correctly, that they were standing somewhere that mattered. The Roman writer Macrobius, in the 5th century, left one of the few detailed descriptions we have of how the oracle here actually worked, and it's stranger and more physical than the image of a whispering priestess most people picture from Delphi. Petitioners would write their questions down and hand them to the priests. The response didn't come as spoken words, it came through the god's cult statue itself, which priests would lift onto their shoulders like a litter and carry through the temple grounds. The statue, or rather the men carrying it, would move forward toward an answer, or in some accounts tilt and gesture in ways the priests then interpreted, sometimes moving with enough apparent force that the bearers said they weren't in control of where their own feet were taking them. Whether that was ritual theater, genuine belief, or some combination the priests themselves couldn't fully separate, we have no way of knowing. What we do know is that people came from across the Eastern Empire to ask their questions here, and that for a working provincial temple to develop a reputation serious enough that a Roman senator wrote it down a full century after Christianity had already become the empire's official religion says something about how deep this site's authority ran, right up until it didn't anymore. And then, slowly, it stopped mattering in the way it once had, not through catastrophe, but through the gradual replacement of one empire's religion with another's. When Christianity became the state religion of the Roman world in the 4th century, the Emperor Theodosius ordered pagan temples across the empire closed or converted, and Baalbek's great court had a basilica built directly into it, using the temple's own stones as building material. The altars where Jupiter had once been honored quietly dismantled or buried under a church floor. When Islamic armies took the region in 636 CE, the site changed hands again, and over the following centuries it was steadily converted into something the ancient priests of Baal, Helios, and Jupiter never would have imagined, a fortress. Successive Islamic dynasties, and briefly the Crusaders passing through the Levant, recognized what the Romans had left them, a nearly indestructible platform of stone, ready-made for defense, and built battlements, towers, and fortified walls directly on top of and around the temple ruins, using loose fallen stones from the temples themselves as material. This, strangely, may be part of why the Trilithon survived intact at all. Because the site kept being militarily useful for over 1,000 years after the last sacrifice was made at Jupiter's altar, it kept being maintained, occupied, and defended rather than abandoned to slow collapse and stone robbing like so many ancient ruins were. The stones were too big to steal anyway. Nobody in the medieval Levant had the means to move an 800-ton block even if they'd wanted to loot it for a building project elsewhere. So the wall just stayed where the Romans left it, buried under 13 centuries of fortification, earthquakes, and slow accumulating history. The fortress period was not always peaceful, either. In 1400, the Central Asian conqueror Timur swept through the Levant on one of the bloodiest campaigns of the late medieval world, and Baalbek, by then a fortified town of real strategic value in the Bekaa corridor, was captured and sacked along with much of the surrounding region, its population scattered or killed in the same campaign that leveled Damascus and Aleppo. The temple platform itself, already reduced to a citadel bristling with medieval battlements bolted onto Roman stone, survived because there was nothing left in it worth burning. The fire and slaughter were reserved for the living town around it. By the time the Ottoman Empire absorbed the region in the 16th century, Baalbek had shrunk to a minor provincial town, its former religious grandeur reduced to a curiosity even for its own residents, its Roman name and Roman gods forgotten by everyone except the 6 columns still standing over the rooftops as a daily, wordless reminder that something enormous had happened here once. The earthquakes were not gentle. The Bekaa Valley sits along a genuinely active fault system, and Baalbek was struck repeatedly across the centuries. Significant tremors in 1170 and 1202 did real damage to the complex, and the most devastating recorded quake hit in 1759, toppling several of the columns that had survived everything else up to that point. Before 1759, contemporary accounts describe 9 columns still standing on the Temple of Jupiter. After it, only 6 remained upright, the same 6 still standing today, still visible from the valley floor, permanently 3 columns short of what they'd been for most of their existence. By the time European travelers began arriving in numbers during the 17th and 18th centuries, drawn by increasingly detailed and increasingly disbelieving written accounts of impossible stones in the Lebanese hills, Baalbek had never actually been lost. It's worth being honest about that, because the story sometimes gets told as a rediscovery, and it wasn't, not for the people who lived there. Local villagers had built their homes among the ruins for over a millennium, farmed the surrounding valley, and knew the 6 columns and the giant stones as simply part of the landscape they'd grown up in, the way anyone grows up next to a mountain and stops noticing its size. What actually happened was a shift in Western academic and public attention, travelers' sketches and measurements, published in Europe, turning a place the locals had always known intimately into an international curiosity almost nobody outside the region had previously heard of. That curiosity crystallized into serious archaeology far later than you'd expect for a site this significant. It took a visit from Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany in 1898, touring the Ottoman-controlled Levant, for a properly funded scientific excavation to actually happen. Impressed by what he saw, Wilhelm sponsored a German archaeological institute mission led by the architect and archaeologist Otto Puckstein, which spent the years around 1900 to 1904 conducting the first rigorous survey, excavation, and documentation of the entire complex. The study that finally produced accurate measurements of the Trilithon and made clear to the wider archaeological world exactly what scale of engineering this was. Restoration and further excavation continued under the French Mandate in the 1920s and 1930s, piecing columns back into position where they safely could be, stabilizing what remained. Baalbek was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1984, formal recognition of something the valley's residents had never needed a certificate to understand. That inscription came during one of the harder stretches in the site's modern history. The 1980s put Baalbek in the middle of the Lebanese civil war and the wider instability of the Bekaa Valley in the decades since, a region that has periodically found itself in international headlines for reasons that have nothing to do with Roman columns. Through all of it, remarkably, the ruins themselves have stayed largely untouched by the conflict around them. No shelling has brought down the 6 standing columns, no fighting has reached the Trilithon wall, and Lebanese authorities and international heritage organizations have continued to treat the site as something worth protecting even when very little else nearby felt protected. It's a strange kind of endurance to add to everything else this place has already survived: earthquakes, empires, a 15th century sack, and now, simply, the modern world happening around it while it keeps standing. Even now, the questions that actually matter about this place remain open. We can calculate, with reasonable confidence, how 40,000 coordinated laborers with rollers and ramps and downhill gravity could move an 800-ton stone. What we can't fully answer is why anyone needed to, at a location that, as an agricultural valley town, not a capital, not a port, not a strategic crossroads, didn't obviously demand the largest religious structure in the entire Roman world. We don't know with certainty whether the massive foundation stones beneath the Trilithon predate Roman rule, incorporated from some earlier phase of construction we barely understand, or whether they, too, are simply the earliest and most ambitious part of the same Roman project, the point at which the builders were still testing exactly how large they could go before they refined the method for the smaller work above. We don't know why the forgotten stone, after however many months of labor to cut it from bedrock, was simply abandoned face down and left to be swallowed by dust for close to 2,000 years, remembered by absolutely no one, until a team with modern excavation equipment happened to dig in exactly the right spot. What we do know is that somewhere in that valley, right now, there may be a fifth stone, or a sixth, still buried, still waiting for someone to notice a slightly unusual rise in the ground and start digging. The quarry has not been fully excavated. Nobody working on this can promise you the biggest stone at Baalbek has already been found. There's something worth noticing in how differently this site treats its own unanswered questions compared to some of the other places we've spent nights walking through together. This isn't a lost city swallowed by jungle, waiting decades for anyone to stumble across it again. It isn't a language nobody can read, or a people who vanished without leaving a name behind. Baalbek was never lost. It was occupied continuously, worshipped in continuously, fought over continuously, for 2,000 uninterrupted years, by people who watched empires rise and replace each other while the same 6 columns stood over their rooftops the entire time. And even with all of that continuity, even with a written Roman record, medieval chronicles, Ottoman surveys, a Kaiser's personal visit, and more than a century of professional excavation by some of the best-funded archaeological institutes in the world, we still can't tell you, with full confidence, exactly how the heaviest hand-cut stones on the planet ended up exactly where they are. Continuity of memory turned out not to be the same thing as an explanation. Sometimes the people living directly on top of a mystery for 2 millennia simply inherited instead of solving it, the same way you might inherit a locked box from a relative and never quite get around to finding out what's inside, because it's always been there, and it will presumably always be there, and there's no particular day that ever feels like the day to finally ask. So if you ever find yourself standing at the base of that wall, looking up at 3 blocks of limestone too large to properly register as objects a human being once cut and carried, let yourself sit in the not knowing for a while instead of reaching for an answer. Sometimes the honest ending to a story like this one is that the people who built it were more capable, more organized, and more willing to attempt the enormous than we tend to give the ancient world credit for, and that we still haven't caught up to understanding exactly how far that capability actually went. Rest well tonight, under whatever roof you're under. Somewhere in Lebanon, 6 columns are still standing against the dark, holding up nothing but the sky, the way they have for almost 2,000 years, waiting for the next person to walk up and ask the same question everyone before them has asked and nobody has ever quite finished answering.